Thanks very much. So this paper, if you can probably tell by the title, is picking up a lot on what was said in the previous talk. But it's also, I'm really happy about the presentations that came before it because it's also relating this to the extended mind thesis. And I think I heard somebody ask a question from the audience at one point about like action and action theory. So this is going to be hopefully the sort of coming together of all of those strands. What I'm going to do in my talk is I'm going to first give a super brief sort of outline of predictive coding, or rather sort of highlight two areas, like two parts of the model that I think is sort of giving rise to these indeterminacy type worries that we've been talking about already. So then I give a brief outline of what I'm taking to be Andy's solution to this in the 2018 paper. And I'm going to say that so on one reading of what action is on that view, exactly these kinds of worries occur where we don't so much get determinacy as we get sort of like unitary perception, but there's still this sort of like frame or horizon of indeterminacy. But I'm going to suggest a possible solution. So a different reading about what action is at the personal level gives you a different result in terms of the way action can constrain perception. And I'm going to call this it's called the basic action view. And this view has a fairly sort of like good action theoretic pedigree. It's coming from originally the work of Anscombe and Davidson does a lot to develop this view, and Arthur Danto, before he was an art critic, had an important role in this. And it's also like it's a view that's pretty widely subscribed to by contemporary action theorists too. But I'm going to say that there are good reasons to think that if we take this view of action, the basic action view, we have principled reasons for excluding non-neural contributions to cognitive processes. And at the personal level, this means that agents are brain-bound, not extended. So I'm going to argue that if Andy, if anyone wants to combine the Bayesian predictive coding view with an account of extended embodied cognitive agents, we should adopt this non-basic action view. And I'm going to sort of gesture towards how that's going to work, but it's not going to be a worked-out account by any means. So this is the sort of typical, boring first slide of any predictive coding talk. It's sort of outlining the model. I'm going to keep it brief, given the audience and what's already been said. So on the left, we've got a sketch of how the Bayesian predictive coding architecture is supposed to work for perception. So at A, we have this sort of like these different processing layers, and how the different contents, so the prediction error, and precision-making mechanisms are supposed to be sort of interacting over these levels. At B, we have sort of a sketch of sort of how the problem arises. So we have these unimodal Gaussians, and the worry, as we've talked already about, is that how do we get from these probabilistic representations to something like what we see at C that looks quite sort of like determinate and univocal. So C and D are taken from a paper in like a visual neuroscience paper. It's not so important what the content of it is, but hopefully, so the idea is like under the right kind of experimental conditions, these two are going to be indistinguishable, C and D. But hopefully, they're not indistinguishable to you right now. So, so what's the difference? How does D differ from C? Just to shout it out. How does it look different? Yes, it's blurry. That's exactly the word. So I want to say that like there's a sort of predictive coding story about how it comes to be that we resolve D into C internally. So while retinal stimulation between the two is ambiguous, we use high-level models to resolve this and deliver this sort of unitary determinate percept that we see at C. And so sort of like as a kind of an indication of where this is going to go, I think some of the trouble comes in when we start to think of the percept as picture-like in the same way that the stimulus is. Let's see, but I'll get on to why that is in a sec. So now we can say a sort of intuitive first brush at what Clark's problem is. So just take the highlighted bit. So it can seem as if the subpersonal story here is failing to make sufficient contact with the personal level experience. So before getting on to the proposal, I want to sort of get sort of two other worries about why we don't need to worry. Two other sort of like solutions or pseudo-solutions out of the way. So some people, so one thing that comes up is people say, well, it's not really the case that we explicitly represent internally these probability distributions, and on certain accounts of how we approximate them, it seems that there's a sense in which the content is far more determinate. We don't encode over the entire range. There's like heaps to say about this, but I think sort of like just very quickly, I think that, wait, I'm going to have a glass of water first. I think that this fails to resolve the worry if we are understanding representation as what the sort of system does with the information. So if we approximate internally some probabilistic distribution, but then the rest of our system uses the content that we've approximately represented, it seems that probably we still have the worry about probabilistic representations, but since the probabilistic content is what's doing the explanatory work. A second worry, which is a very different kind of worry, but certainly something I've heard, is people have said to me stuff like, well, why are you worried at all about these subpersonal representations? You know, we have the personal level and we have the subpersonal level. If you're just talking about subpersonal stuff, well, that's very interesting from a sort of cognitive science, neuroscientific point of view, but that's just not, that doesn't necessarily carry over into experience in any way. And so I think that this response comes from a certain understanding of what the personal level is and what the subpersonal level is and how they're supposed to be interacting. So the reason I think that it's a genuine worry that really needs a solution is because I go along with Andy Clark and with others in subscribing to a view of the subpersonal and personal that construes in terms of types of explanation rather than specifying types of entity. So I think what people who say, oh, well, why worry about the subpersonal level? They're assuming that the subpersonal-personal distinction is a kind of is an ontological distinction between different kinds of states. States of persons on one hand, and states of the brain on the other. But I think Zoe Dreesen's work here is very helpful in putting pressure on that reading of the distinction. So what she says is sort of like paraphrasing Dennett here, or interpreting Dennett, that when we're talking about the personal and subpersonal, we're saying that in addition to our everyday, archetypically sort of folk psychological explanations, I did this because I had a belief and desire that made me do this and so on, there are subpersonal psychological explanations that function by a kind of, that work by a kind of functional analysis. So you take a personal level state as an explanatory target, and then you explain it in terms of subpersonal mechanisms, subprocesses, or subpersons. So it's a kind of functional decomposition story. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to refer to these two accounts, that is, these two explanatory strategies, as vertical versus horizontal explanation. And vertical explanation is this functional decomposition. So in this view, the distinction is primarily methodological. When we're talking about states at the personal level, we explain their features by reference to features of states at the subpersonal level. So when we're talking about states of perceptual awareness or perceptual consciousness, we explain the contents of those in terms of contents that we find at the subpersonal level. And so this brings us on to Clark's problem, which I'm going to say is really two problems. So on a couple of slides back, we saw these two features of the Bayesian predictive coding mechanism. So it has distributions that are, it has representations that are on one hand probabilistic and on the other hand distributed. I think that the probabilistic or statistical character of representations gives rise to what I'm calling the fuzzy picture problem. So if the subpersonal representations that we explain the content of our personal level representational states by encode a range of encode a range of values, we might worry why it seems to us that our experience presents us with a single value. On the other hand, I think the distributed character of the underlying representational mechanisms gives rise to this unified field problem. So at any moment in the cycle of prediction, error, minimization, and Bayesian updating, there are multiple models at different levels of temporal and spatial detail. So perceptual experience seems to present us with a unified field. And I'm saying that this worry doesn't just tell against this kind of Cartesian theater single representational take. On the face of it, we might wonder why the multiple and distributed representations underlying perception should give us anything like the semantic coherence that our experience seems to present us with. And so another important thing to note at this point, I think that these are problems not really about how you could get a Bayesian system to deliver contents that could do this. I mean, I think notoriously, if you build in the right kinds of priors and mechanisms for precision updating and so on, you can deliver these contents. But rather, I think it's about giving us a sort of a strong theoretical basis for searching for these in the first place. So rather, it's a question of why should a Bayesian predictive coding mechanism deliver this kind of content? So anti-solution is an ecological and an action-oriented solution. Since the agent needs to act effectively in her environment, her perceptual system should put her in a position to do this, and that's why we're justified in positing mechanisms that bring this about. So the question that sprung to my mind when I was reading this is like, well, what's action? So I want to rule out at least one proposal, which would be that sort of like subpersonal motor commands, these kinds of things, ought to be what's doing this, playing this constraining role. I think the reason for this, there's two reasons I want to quickly survey. One of them is that on the sort of radical predictive coding model that Clark, Friston, Howie, etc. endorse, actions themselves are going to have a somewhat probabilistic character corresponding. They're just sort of high order proprioceptive predictions that get sent down to mechanisms involved in action performance. So it's unclear that they are going to have the kind of unitary determinate character that plausibly they would have to. There's also, which was covered in the previous talk, some sort of like empirical prima facie reasons to worry about this. The dissociation between dorsal and ventral stream processing, so vision for action versus vision for perception. And I think the point that what we're talking about here is action planning is well taken. We need to have, I think, a solution that's pitched at a wider, more systemic level, so that there's a system-wide constraint on perceptual content. Another thing that you might think of is like, well, I mean, the active body, what the body actually does in space, that's determinate. I mean, it's a physical object. It has determinate bounds, and it can only do one thing at a time. That's true, but I think it leaves things rather opaque as to how perceptual content is going to be constrained by the body, even on a pretty generous reading of sort of embodied cognition claims. So I think that there are two possible ways that we can solve the problem. So one of them is to talk in terms of the personal level intention to act. So my conscious intentions, my conscious processes of action selection. And I think it's a very plausible reading. I think it's the reading that we've already discussed, and I think that that on this view it potentially leads to the same problems, that you don't really constrain perception to be fully determinate. And so I'm going to wonder if there's another account of action where we can build in these features at the personal level, so they will give us a reason to expect determinate content. Okay, so now we get to the sort of action theoretical part of the talk. So the classic example that I'm going to rely on is first introduced by Donald Davidson, and it has to do with sort of like archetypical action. So if I wake up at night and I think something's up in the house, and I turn the light on to investigate that, and I thereby alert because there is something up, there's a burglar, and the burglar is alerted to my presence by the light turning on. So plausibly, I mean, in our everyday talk about actions, we call all of these an action, right? Like I flick the switch, I illuminate the room, I alert the burglar. That's not an intentional action, but it's still an action. And so, but it's also a string of sort of like causal events in space. So here's Davidson talking about the issue here. So if I turn on the light, then I must have done it in a precise moment in a particular way. This is the actual behavior of the active body. So every detail there is fixed. But it doesn't make any sense to demand that my want, my desire, my planning process be directed to an action performed at any one moment or done in any unique manner. So I think here is the case where a kind of distinction between means and end opens up the space for a kind of indeterminacy. But Davidson isn't happy to leave things just as he does in those quotes. He's interested in bringing the actual behavior of the body under the regime of a determinate intended action. So the notion of a basic action is introduced to fulfill this role. Yes. Oh, an important thing I should notice. So when I'm talking about different actions, like flicking the switch, illuminating the room, and so on, according to a pretty widely accepted principle in action theory, this is not describing multiple different actions. This is describing the same action in different ways, and that's, I think, a plausible rule. So what is a basic action? So in line with what I've said before about the need for a systemic state or a systemic process, basic actions are things that you attribute to whole agents, they're personal level phenomena. But they're also determinate bodily events under some description. So the way we get to them is by something like this. If I'm illuminating the room, there's a question, well, how do I illuminate the room? And the answer to that, to this how-to question, is like, well, I flick the switch. So I flick the switch in order to illuminate the room. The basic action emerges when you can't do that anymore. That is, so if flicking the switch is a basic action, which is a controversial claim, but say it is, it's a basic action because it's directly performed. I don't do anything else in order to perform that act. So this enables basic actions to specify a fully determinate content, the intention in the action. And extended performances on this view are understood as a kind of concatenation of basic actions. And I'm going to say that this is a sort of a promising solution to both the unitary content and fuzzy picture problem, because just as in the sort of like the more commonsensical intentions to act, which are sort of specifying these long goal plans, those, I think, ground unitary contents because you need to have a semantically unified intention, even if it is indeterminate. When it's a basic action, it seems to be both semantically unified and fully determinate. So this is, I'm suggesting, a promising potential solution, except there's a problem with this solution from the point of view of embodied extended cognition. I'm going to suggest that let me see. Yeah. To show how this arises, I'm going to say why I think that the extended embodied account is what the extended embodied account is committed to in terms of personal level states. So what I'm sort of like suggesting as a way to get at the extended account is that we take some personal level mental state, say my belief about the location of MoMA in New York, and then we do a functional analysis, one of these vertical explanations of how that state is realized. If in the process of this we find a contribution of a non-neural process, then the state is an embodied extended state. And so more generally, if an agent has personal level states that are amenable to this kind of functional analysis, then that agent is to that extent an embodied extended agent. In a recent paper, Andy's related this to the notion of a Markov blanket. So for this image here, we can see that the agent is defined in terms of states around it, and these statistically fix the state at this node in the center of the Markov blanket. So how does extension work in this context? Well, it's just to say that whatever falls under the agent is within the Markov blanket that's relevant for explaining behavior and action. So the claim is that agents are able to dynamically extend Markov blankets relevant to their cognitive processes beyond their proximal bodily situation. And the means by which they do this is a kind of active coupling with their environment. But this approach relies on identifying the right kind of personal level target for functional analysis. And this is a theoretical choice that I'm saying needs to be motivated. So the basic action view identifies as the sort of archetypical action, or the action that's really the target of explanation, a notion of basic actions, which I'm going to say is radically brain-bound or body-bound. So getting at this point, I'm giving this quote from a paper by Doug Lavin. So events, including the movements of one's own body when one intentionally moves it, are thought to be, on the basic action view, constitutively independent of the subject's rational capacities. Basic action is needed as a necessary countermeasure, a sort of metaphysical containment wall needed to preserve the separate jurisdictions of mind and the action and the acting subject and what merely happens. So for me, this is the very same move of ensuring determinacy by excluding means-end reasoning seems to also ensure disembodiment. And I think this is a principal reason for excluding all non-neural contributions to person-level states of action. So a strong reading of this in the literature, Jennifer Hornsby, who locates actions as the proximal output of the motor system. She has to sloganize, actions are events that take place beneath the skin. And finding this quote, I thought this is really devastating for an extended and embodied view. But it's also somewhat controversial within the action theoretical literature, and I think she's herself moved away from this position in later work. But even if the basic action isn't an action beneath an event beneath my skin, and it's just the basic movement of my body, I still think it excludes these kinds of sort of looping interactions with the environment that to me are sort of fundamental to the extended embodied view. So I think even on the weaker view, there are problems with this account. Yeah, so this is sort of like the argument I've given simplified. So if you take this subpersonal account of what an extended agent is that I showed you earlier, that we identify a target for explanation, we pursue the functional analysis, and if we find non-neural contributions, then that is extended agency, or that's the basis for extended agency. And we claim that coupling with the environment is an action. We have a sort of a general argument, not only against the possibility of extended actions, but I think against the possibility of all extended mental states. So Otto needs to act to consult his notebook, and in acting, he's defining the boundary of his personal level active state in such a way that anything that goes on from that point it becomes an external contribution, rather than external to the agent, rather than just external to the body. So if all actions are basic actions, and as I hope I've established, basic actions are brain-bound, there can't be extended embodied cognitive agents. So this is a problem. So is there an alternative view? I want to say that there is, and this is the sketchier part of my talk. So the kind of words that I've just given aren't all that new. I think Jacob Howie has a version of this. I think David Chalmers also. The idea that action and perception represent principal boundaries to the cognitive agent. So presumably there are the resources within the view to respond to these objections. So I think at this point it's worthwhile sort of like taking a step back and seeing how we got to this situation. And I think that the issue is that the basic actions they're introduced to be a kind of a backstop. And like some other backstops in the news, they seemed innocuous at first, but they lead to a lot of problems now. So what's motivating them? Well, I think the point of them, the way they're theoretically introduced, it's a claim about the sort of the ontology of mental states, of active states, of actions, and events. Namely, one that draws a sharp distinction between actions and events. So we need to exclude what merely happens from the means-end reasoning that's characteristic of cognition, and the point at which means-end cognition meets sort of like, the causal events of the world is the basic action. But for me, the extended embodied view, the whole point of it is not excluding mere events from means and roles, and is more permissive about what counts then as a candidate for the subpersonal explanation of personal level states. So I think that we should feel free to posit personal level entities, but the personal level entities that we have to posit in this case, I think, are actions as temporally extended unities that supervene on the events that we describe in these functional analyses. So I think Andy's already gestured in this direction at several points, particularly in his response to how he's sort of epistemically flavored versions of these kinds of objections. So not seeing action as the issue, but seeing sort of knowledge as the issue, where Clark invokes this idea of a sort of a process ontology of organisms, whereby the persisting agent can be identified with a rolling process that builds and rebuilds her own evidentiary boundaries on the fly. I'm suggesting that sort of perceptual states are having this similar processual, temporally extended character. So to sum up, what we have here is two different accounts of perception and action. So if we identify as a personal level target an extended agential unity, we have also the resources to identify extended perceptual unities and thereby include non-neural contributions. On the other hand, if we adopt the approach of bodily actions as basic actions, I think we're constrained also to have a certain account of the personal level goings on in perception, namely this kind of snapshot perceptual experience, and that's what, to bring you right back to the beginning of my talk, that's what I was referring to in the experimental paradigm I described. And so there we are constrained also in the kinds of vertical explanations we perform, namely we take this punctuate static object, we explain it in terms of what contributes to it at the subpersonal level. These are definitionally internal processes, and we're stuck with a non-extended view. So I think both of these views are completely coherent, and it's not my aim to argue for one or the other, but rather I'm claiming that if we want extended agency, we have to allow a certain amount of indeterminacy in perceptual experience. So that's more or less the same thing. So Clark's trying to show why Bayesian predictive coding should support unitary and determinate perception. His action-oriented strategy, I think, tacitly relies on, to be fully successful, the notion of a basic action, but basic actions are incompatible with the extended view, whereas views of personal level events that are more compatible with the extended view are only sufficient to grant us perceptual unity, not fully determinate perception. But I don't think that's such a terrible thing. Thanks.